The Bookstore Cat and the Male Slot Mouse, a funny and cozy Christmas sleep story. Jasper was a marmalade cat of considerable girth and even more considerable self-importance. His fur was the color of autumn leaves and marmalade preserves, striped with bands of cream and burnt orange that rippled when he walked, which was not often, and not quickly when he did. He possessed the kind of face that suggested he had opinions about everything and found most things beneath his notice. His amber eyes held a perpetual expression of mild disappointment, as though the world had failed to meet his admittedly high standards. He was, by his own estimation, which was the only estimation that mattered, the true proprietor of Bramble Books, a cozy independent bookstore nestled on a corner street in a town that knew how to appreciate both good literature and lazy cats. The human who believed herself to be the owner was a woman named Margaret, a kindly soul in her late 50s with reading glasses perpetually perched on her nose and ink stains perpetually decorating her fingers. She had purchased the bookstore 15 years ago, but Jasper had arrived as a kitten shortly thereafter, and he had quickly established that while Margaret might handle the tiresome business of ordering books and managing the till, he was the one who set the true tone of the establishment. He decided who received the honor of his presence on their lap while they browsed. He determined which sunbeams were suitable for napping, and at what times. He graciously accepted pets and chin scratches from customers, though he made it clear through the languid pace of his purring that he was doing them a favor by allowing such intimacies. The bookstore itself was exactly the sort of place that would employ a cat of Jasper's caliber. It occupied a narrow building with bow windows that bulged gently into the street, their glass old and slightly wavy, giving everything viewed through them a dreamy quality. Inside, the shop was a glorious chaos of floor-to-ceiling shelves crammed with books of every description. The scent was intoxicating, a perfume composed of aging paper, leather bindings, the vanilla-sweet smell of old book glue, and the sharper, crisper scent of new paperbacks fresh from their boxes. Margaret kept a small coffee maker on her desk in the back corner, and the aroma of fresh brew mingled with the book smell in a way that made customers linger far longer than they had planned, which was of course excellent for business. Jasper had claimed several prime territories within this kingdom. There was the front window seat, where a faded velvet cushion had been molded by his body into a perfect cat-shaped depression. From this vantage point he could observe the street while soaking in whatever sunlight managed to pierce the gray winter sky. There was the history section's top shelf, accessible only by a precarious leap that Jasper had mastered in his younger, more athletic days, and now reached via a more dignified route involving strategic use of lower shelves as stepping stones. And there was his favorite spot of all, the wingback chair near the fireplace, where Margaret had long ago given up trying to keep him off, eventually accepting that the chair was his, and she would simply have to sit elsewhere. His days followed a predictable and deeply satisfying routine. He would begin each morning by inspecting the shop, padding slowly through each aisle as though conducting a royal survey of his lands. He would then install himself in whichever sunny spot called to him, where he would nap until customers arrived and required his supervision. Customer service, in Jasper's view, consisted primarily of allowing himself to be admired. If someone was sitting in the reading nook and seemed sufficiently calm and worthy, he might bestow upon them the honor of his company, leaping into their lap with a heavy thud and settling with much kneading and rearranging before deigning to purr. He never chased dust motes or played with toys. Such undignified behavior was beneath him. He was a cat of leisure and contemplation, a philosopher in fur. This peaceful existence had continued undisturbed for many years, through countless seasons and countless customers, each day bleeding gently into the next in exactly the way Jasper preferred. And then, one particularly bitter November evening, as the first real snow of the season began to fall, something small and brown and desperate discovered the mail slot. The mail slot was an original feature of the old building, a horizontal brass opening in the heavy oak door, positioned about 2 feet from the ground. It had a hinged flap on the outside that could swing inward to allow letters and small packages to tumble onto the welcome mat within. The flap was stiff with age and cold, and there was a gap, just the smallest space between the flap's edge and the door's frame. To a human, it would have been nothing, invisible. To a field mouse fleeing the sudden cruel turn of weather, it was everything. The mouse was a tiny creature, barely the size of a human thumb, with soft gray-brown fur and ears like delicate pink petals. She had been living in the garden behind the row of shops, making her home in a pile of old flower pots, surviving on scattered seeds and the occasional dropped crumb from the cafe 2 doors down. But when the temperature plummeted and the snow began in earnest, the garden became a deadly place. She had ventured out seeking shelter, running along the building's foundation, squeezing through impossibly small spaces, until she found the gap at the mail slot. It was perfect. The brass flap, heated ever so slightly by the warmth leaking from inside the shop, created a tiny pocket that was sheltered from the wind and snow. The opening gave her a clear view of the street outside, allowing her to watch for danger. And inside, just beyond the flap, was warmth, though she dared not venture further. She could smell the complex, papery scent of the bookstore, could hear the muffled sounds of human activity. She tucked herself into the small space between the flap and the doorframe, her tiny body barely visible, and there she stayed. Jasper noticed the mouse on her second day of residence. He had been conducting his morning inspection when he caught an unfamiliar scent near the front door. He approached the welcome mat with his whiskers twitching, his body lowering into what might have been a hunting crouch if he had been a different sort of cat. He could see her, just barely, a minute smudge of brown in the shadow of the mail slot. His tail gave a single reflexive lash, and then Jasper made a decision that would have shocked his wild ancestors. He sat down, wrapped his substantial tail around his paws, and thought about the situation. To catch the mouse, he would need to move quickly. He would need to pounce, to squeeze himself against the door, to scrabble at the mail slot with his paws. It would be undignified. It would be tiring. And more importantly, the mouse was technically outside. The mail slot was a threshold, a boundary. On this side was his territory, his comfortable, climate-controlled domain. On that side was the outside world, a place of weather and effort and general unpleasantness. The mouse was not in his bookstore. The mouse was merely looking into his bookstore, like any other creature peering through a window. Jasper had no quarrel with window shoppers, even very small, brown, whiskered ones. He yawned elaborately, gave the mail slot one last dismissive glance, and padded away to find his sunny spot. The mouse could stay. It was of no consequence to him. This was not mercy, he told himself. This was simply a matter of territorial boundaries and the conservation of energy. The mouse, for her part, remained absolutely still until the enormous orange cat had departed. Her heart, no bigger than a split pea, hammered in her chest. She had been certain her brief life was about to end, but the cat had looked at her with those huge amber eyes and then simply walked away. She did not understand this. She understood hunger and cold, predators and safety, but this lazy dismissal was outside her experience. Still, she was alive, and the spot was warm, and so she stayed. Days passed, and then weeks, and a strange equilibrium established itself. Jasper grew accustomed to the tiny presence at the mail slot. Occasionally, when passing the door, he would glance over and see the small brown shape tucked into its space, and he would feel a peculiar satisfaction. It was rather like having a very boring piece of art installed in one's home. You stopped noticing it actively, but you would notice if it were suddenly gone. The mouse, too, grew less fearful. She learned the rhythm of the bookstore, the opening and closing times, the particular heavy tread of Margaret's footsteps versus the lighter steps of customers. And she learned the sound of Jasper, the surprising softness of his walk, the jingle of the small bell on his collar that Margaret had insisted he wear over his strenuous objections. The mouse watched the bookstore from her slot the way others might watch television. She saw customers come and go, saw them running their fingers along spines, saw them settling into chairs with their selections. She saw Margaret making her endless cups of coffee, sorting through mail, wrapping purchases in brown paper tied with string. And she saw Jasper, always Jasper, napping in pools of light, accepting tributes of affection, moving with regal slowness from one comfortable spot to another. From her tiny vantage point, the bookstore seemed like a different world, warm and golden and impossibly vast. She could not have known that she and Jasper were, in their own ways, watching exactly the same thing. The last day before the holiday arrived with a bitter wind and a sky heavy with the promise of more snow. It was the 23rd of December, and Bramble Books would be closing for 3 days to allow Margaret a rare rest. This meant that today would be chaotic, filled with desperate last-minute shoppers seeking perfect gifts and remembering forgotten relatives. Margaret had arrived early to prepare, brewing extra coffee and making sure the gift-wrapping station was well stocked with paper and ribbon. Jasper had sensed the coming storm of activity and had strategically positioned himself in the front window seat before the shop even opened. From here, he could observe without being in the way, could enjoy his sunbeam while watching the approaching chaos with detached amusement. He had arranged himself in his most photogenic position, one paw tucked elegantly beneath his chest, his tail curled around his considerable haunches, his face angled toward the street in a pose of noble contemplation. Several passers-by had already stopped to take photographs through the glass, and he had graciously allowed this, not even twitching an ear to acknowledge their cooing admiration. The mouse, too, had settled into her spot early. The mail slot had been briefly disturbed when Margaret had collected the morning post. But the mouse had simply pressed herself flat against the doorframe until the danger passed, and then resumed her position. From her view, she could see the street where early morning shoppers were already hurrying past, their breath forming white clouds, their arms wrapped tightly around themselves against the cold. The cafe 2 doors down was doing brisk business, and she could smell coffee and cinnamon rolls, scents that made her tiny stomach clench with longing. But she was safe and relatively warm, and that was more than she had hoped for when the snows had first come. At 9 o'clock precisely, Margaret unlocked the front door and flipped the sign from closed to open. The bell above the door, a cheery brass thing that Jasper found unnecessarily loud, gave its bright jingle. The first customer entered almost immediately, bringing with her a swirl of cold air that made Jasper's fur ripple and caused the mouse to huddle deeper into her space. The woman was middle-aged, wearing a red wool coat and an expression of determined panic. She made a beeline for Margaret. "I need something for my nephew," she announced, peeling off her gloves. "He's 15. He likes fantasy books, I think. Or maybe science fiction. Do teenagers still read? Please tell me they still read." Margaret, who had managed similar crises for 2 decades, smiled reassuringly and began steering the woman toward the young adult section. "Let me show you some options. We have some wonderful new releases." Jasper watched this interaction with the bored air of someone who had seen it all before. The gift-buying panic of humans amused him. They seemed incapable of planning ahead, always rushing in at the last moment with wild eyes and clutching fistfuls of crumpled lists. He found their stress unnecessary and slightly distasteful. If humans were more like cats, they would nap more and worry less. The world would be much improved. The mouse watched the same woman enter and saw something entirely different. She saw a giant creature bringing danger and cold, saw the door swinging wide to reveal the deadly winter world beyond. She saw the woman's boots, impossibly huge, stomping across the welcome mat just inches from her hiding spot. Each footfall sent vibrations through the floor that the mouse could feel in her small bones. When the door finally closed again, sealing away the cold, the mouse's tiny chest heaved with relief. The morning progressed and the shop grew steadily busier. A young man came in seeking poetry, was directed to the appropriate section, and spent 40 minutes reading snippets aloud in a soft voice to himself before settling on a slim volume of Mary Oliver. An elderly gentleman arrived seeking a history of naval warfare and ended up in a lengthy discussion with Margaret about the Battle of Trafalgar, much to the impatience of the 3 people waiting behind him. A woman with an enormous handbag knocked over an entire display of bookmarks, spent 5 mortified minutes picking them up, bought nothing, and fled. Through it all, Jasper maintained his position in the window, moving only to shift into a fresh patch of sunlight when his current spot grew too cool. His eyes were half closed, giving him the appearance of sleep, but he was in fact watching everything with keen attention. He liked to think of himself as the shop's security system vigilantly monitoring for suspicious behavior, though in truth he had never once alerted Margaret to anything, and his definition of suspicious behavior was anything that might require him to move. Around 11 o'clock, the chaos intensified. The door began opening and closing with increasing frequency, each time bringing a blast of cold air and a new, desperate customer. The shop grew crowded, bodies pressing between the narrow shelves, voices rising in volume as people asked Margaret for recommendations, directions, gift-wrapping services. The bell above the door jingled so continuously that it became a steady background chime, as much a part of the atmosphere as the scent of coffee and old paper. And then came the child. She was perhaps 5 years old, wearing a puffy pink coat that made her look like a small ambulatory marshmallow, and she possessed the kind of piercing energy that suggested an excess of sugar and insufficient supervision. Her mother was distracted, deep in conversation with Margaret about a book order, and the child had been set loose to look at the picture books quietly. "We're only here for a minute." The child did not look quietly. The child had apparently never done anything quietly in her short, loud life. She galloped through the shop with arms outstretched like airplane wings, making zooming sounds. She crashed into a display of staff recommendations, sending several paperbacks tumbling to the floor. She discovered the step stool Margaret used for reaching high shelves and decided it was a throne, climbing atop it and announcing to no one in particular that she was the queen of books. Jasper, disturbed from his window seat by the commotion, opened his eyes fully for the first time all morning and fixed the child with a look of profound disapproval. His ears, which had been relaxed, now swiveled backward into what cat behaviorists call airplane ears, a sure sign of irritation. His tail began to lash, a slow, deliberate movement that spoke volumes about his displeasure. The child, spotting him, let out a shriek of delight that could have shattered glass. "Kitty!" she screamed, abandoning her throne and thundering toward the window seat with all the grace of a small rhinoceros. Jasper made a decision. With more speed than he had displayed in months, he evacuated the window seat, leaping down and fleeing toward the back of the shop. He was not afraid, he told himself as he trotted with undignified haste toward the safety of the history section. He was simply strategically relocating to a more suitable observation post, one that did not contain small, loud humans with grabby hands. He found refuge on his high shelf in the history section, accessible via his series of stepping stone shelves. Once installed, he settled himself and began grooming his ruffled fur with determined licks, trying to reclaim some dignity. Below, he could hear the child being corralled by her mother, the usual apologies being issued to Margaret. The bell jingled as they departed. Peace, blessed peace, returned. The mouse, tucked in her mail slot, had witnessed the entire incident from a very different perspective. When the child had burst through the door, the mouse had frozen in terror. The small human had been moving with the chaotic energy of a predator, loud and unpredictable and dangerous. The mouse had pressed herself as flat as possible against the metal of the slot, making herself invisible, becoming nothing more than a shadow. She had watched those small pink boots stomp past her hiding spot, had heard the shrieking, had felt the vibrations of running feet. And then, mercifully, the small human had left, the door had closed, and the world had grown calmer. In this moment, if either the cat or the mouse had been capable of discussing their experience, they might have discovered they had felt remarkably similar things, fear and irritation and relief. But they were not capable of such discussions, and so they remained in their separate spaces, unaware that they had in fact just shared an experience. The afternoon brought a different sort of customer, less frantic but more focused. These were the serious book lovers, the ones who had waited until the crowds thinned to do their browsing. They moved slowly through the shop, tilting their heads to read spines, pulling books out to examine covers and flip through pages. They sat in the reading chairs and lost themselves in first chapters. They asked Margaret thoughtful questions about themes and writing styles. These were Jasper's favorite sort of humans, and he descended from his high perch to move among them, allowing them to admire him properly. One woman, settling into the wingback chair with a novel, was honored with Jasper's presence. He leaped into her lap without invitation, circled 3 times, kneaded her thighs with his substantial paws until she winced, and finally settled with a grunt of satisfaction. His purr, when it started, was like a small motor, rumbling and deep. The woman, recognizing the privilege that had been bestowed upon her, abandoned any thought of reading and simply sat, one hand resting on Jasper's warm back staring into the fireplace and smiling. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, fat flakes drifting past the windows and settling on the street. The afternoon light, already dim, grew dimmer. Margaret turned on more lamps, and the shop glowed with warm, golden light that made the windows look like paintings, inviting rectangles of comfort in the gray world outside. People hurrying past on the sidewalk would pause to look in, drawn by that light and the glimpse of shelves and books, and the orange cat presiding over it all from the lap of a content customer. The mouse watched the snow falling and felt something almost like contentment. Her spot was warm. Outside was cold. She was small and safe, tucked into her impossible little shelter. Below her, she could see snowflakes accumulating on the doorstep, each one a tiny, perfect crystal that melted almost as soon as it landed. She watched humans pass by on the street, hurrying through the snow, and she saw them the way one might watch clouds, as enormous, incomprehensible forces that moved according to their own mysterious purposes. As the afternoon faded toward evening, the pace of customers slowed to a trickle. Margaret began the process of tidying up, reshelving books that had been examined and rejected, straightening displays, collecting abandoned coffee cups. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to embers, and she added another log, sending up a shower of sparks and releasing a fresh wave of woody warmth into the shop. Jasper, disturbed from the lap that had grown cold when its owner finally, reluctantly, purchased her book, and departed, moved to his final position of the day, his beloved cushion in the front window. The snow was falling more heavily now, and the streetlights had come on, casting cones of yellow light through the swirling white. It was beautiful in the way that winter could be when you were inside looking out, when you were warm and fed and had no need to venture into the cold. Jasper arranged himself and began his evening bath, pulling each paw toward his face to lick between the toes, smoothing his whiskers, cleaning behind his ears. The last few customers of the day arrived in a rush, all clearly in the final throes of panic. A man burst in asking if Margaret had anything at all, appropriate for his mother-in-law, someone he clearly did not know well and was not particularly fond of. Margaret, with the patience of a saint, directed him toward a tasteful cookbook. A pair of teenagers came in seeking a graphic novel for a friend, spent 15 minutes whispering and giggling in the appropriate section, and left with their purchase wrapped in brown paper, looking pleased with themselves. An old woman, a regular customer whom Margaret greeted by name, came in simply to buy a book for herself because she liked having a new story to begin on a holiday, and refused any gift wrapping because, why would I wrap a gift I'm giving myself? Finally, at 6 o'clock, Margaret locked the door and flipped the sign to closed. The shop fell into a profound silence, the kind that only comes when a space that has been full of activity suddenly empties. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the satisfied quiet of a day's work completed, of a purpose fulfilled. Margaret moved through the shop, turning off lights, banking the fire, tidying the last few displaced books. Jasper followed her, winding between her legs, purring and occasionally offering small chirping meows that served as commentary on her activities. Yes, I know," Margaret said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You've had a very difficult day, supervising all those customers. Very exhausting work. All that napping and being admired." Jasper purred louder, accepting the truth of this statement. Margaret disappeared into the back room and returned with 2 items. The first was a small dish containing several pieces of fresh salmon, a holiday treat that she had brought from home. She set this on the floor near Jasper's food station, and he approached it with interest, sniffing delicately before deigning to take a bite. Salmon. Acceptable. He settled in to eat, purring between bites. The second item Margaret carried was a small saucer containing crumbs from a cookie she had been eating earlier. Sugar cookie with bits of icing still clinging to the fragments. She had noticed the small presents at the mail slot weeks ago, had seen the tiny brown mouse tucked into its impossible shelter. She was a practical woman and knew that mice in bookstores were generally undesirable, that they could damage books and create unsanitary conditions. But this mouse was not in her shop. This mouse was technically outside, living in the door's threshold, and she had seen Jasper look at it and walk away. She had seen the unspoken truce, and she had decided to honor it. She approached the front door quietly, not wanting to startle the small creature. She knelt, her knees protesting at the movement, and gently placed the saucer on the welcome mat, just a few inches from the mail slot. She could see the mouse, just barely, a small brown smudge in the shadow of the brass flap. She watched as the mouse's tiny nose twitched, catching the scent of sugar and butter. "Happy holiday, little one," Margaret whispered. "Stay warm." She stood, collected her coat and bag, took one last look around the shop that was her life's work and pride, and let herself out the back door, locking it behind her. The shop settled into darkness, lit only by the glow of streetlights through the windows and the dying embers of the fire. Jasper, having finished his salmon, performed his after-dinner grooming ritual, and then made his way to the wingback chair. This was his nighttime spot, his sleeping throne. He circled 3 times, kneaded the cushion, and settled himself into a perfect loaf shape, paws tucked beneath his chest, tail wrapped around his body. His eyes closed to slits, then closed entirely. His breathing deepened. Within minutes he was asleep, and his purr, now softer, continued like the rumble of distant thunder, a sound of absolute contentment. At the front door, the mouse emerged from the mail slot's shadow. She could smell the crumbs, could see the small saucer just a short distance away. She hesitated, every instinct screaming that the open floor was dangerous, that she should stay in her shelter. But the scent was irresistible, and the shop was quiet and still. She crept forward, whiskers twitching, ears swiveling to catch any hint of danger. She reached the saucer and found the cookie crumbs, sweet and buttery and wonderful. She ate quickly, nibbling with rapid movements of her tiny jaw, her eyes constantly watching for threats that did not come. When she had eaten her fill, she returned to her spot at the mail slot, settling back into the warmth of her impossible little shelter. Her stomach was full. She was warm. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the street in white, muffling all sound. Inside, the bookstore was dark and peaceful, the kind of peaceful that comes from safety and satisfaction. She could hear faintly from somewhere deep within the shop, a soft rumbling sound. It took her a moment to identify it, the purr of the enormous orange cat that had, for reasons she could never understand, decided not to eat her. The sound was oddly comforting, a reminder that she was not alone in the darkness, that another creature shared this space and this quiet night. The mouse tucked herself more tightly into her spot, her tiny body curled into the smallest possible ball to conserve warmth. Her breathing slowed, her eyes closed, and there, in the threshold between inside and outside, between the warmth of the bookstore and the cold of the winter night, the small brown mouse fell asleep. In his wingback chair, Jasper slept the sleep of the righteous and well-fed, dreaming whatever dreams came to lazy, self-important cats. Perhaps he dreamed of endless sunny spots and salmon every day, and a world full of humans who existed solely to pet him. Perhaps he did not dream at all, simply floated in the warm darkness of deep sleep. Neither the cat nor the mouse knew, or would ever know, that they had shared something profound over these winter weeks. They had shared a space, however divided. They had shared a view of the same small world, the bookshop and its customers and the snowy street beyond. They had shared an understanding, unspoken and perhaps not even conscious, that peace was more valuable than conflict, that a small warmth shared was better than a large warmth fought over. They had discovered in their own ways that the most unexpected companionships can bloom in the most unlikely places, and that kindness, whether deliberate or accidental, creates its own kind of magic. Outside, the snow fell steadily, transforming the familiar street into something clean and new and beautiful. The bookstore windows glowed faintly in the darkness, those warm rectangles promising shelter and stories and the quiet comfort of well-loved spaces. Inside, a cat slept in luxury, his purr a soft rumble of contentment. At the threshold, in the smallest of shelters, a mouse slept in safety, her tiny heart beating its rapid, delicate rhythm. And somewhere beyond the walls and the snow, in homes scattered throughout the town, people were settling in with the books they had purchased that day, opening covers, beginning first sentences, losing themselves in stories. Some would read until late into the night, turning pages by lamplight, reluctant to let the narrative go. Others would manage only a chapter or two before sleep claimed them, the books falling open on their chests, bookmarks forgotten. And still others would wrap their purchases and place them under trees, small rectangular promises of worlds to be discovered, adventures to be had, emotions to be felt. This was what the bookstore gave to the world, these doorways to elsewhere, these paper and ink portals to other lives and other times. And Jasper and his small, unlikely neighbor were part of that gift, though they would never know it. They were part of the magic of Bramble Books, the sense that it was a special place, a warm place, a place where even a lazy cat and a tiny mouse could find their own peculiar peace. The night deepened. The snow continued its quiet work, erasing footprints, softening edges, creating a hushed and holy silence. Inside the bookstore, two creatures slept, safe and warm and fed, separated by yards of space and an unbridgeable gulf of species, but connected nonetheless by the invisible threads of shared experience, of mutual forbearance, of accidental grace. Tomorrow, Margaret would return and open the shop again. Tomorrow, new customers would arrive seeking gifts and stories and the particular comfort that only a bookstore can provide. Tomorrow, Jasper would resume his duties as the shop's self-appointed overlord, napping and accepting tribute and maintaining his dignified watch. Tomorrow, the mouse would remain in her spot, observing the world through her small, safe window. But tonight, on this last night before the holiday, in this small corner of the world, all was well. The cat purred, the mouse dreamed, the snow fell, and the bookstore held them all in its patient, loving embrace, as it had for years and would for years to come, a sanctuary of words and warmth and the quiet companionship of small, everyday miracles. If this story resonated with you, if it brought you some measure of peace or a smile in the darkness, please consider showing your support with a like and subscribe to Deep Sleep Stories Hub for more quiet nights and restful journeys. May you sleep as deeply as Jasper, as safely as the small mouse in the mail slot, and wake to a world made fresh and new, ready for whatever stories tomorrow brings.